Hi, I'm Kirk Tomei, and I'm the lead technical designer here at Cloud Imperium Games.
My name's Mark Gaben. I'm a senior gameplay programmer here, and I'm also known as the Bug Smasher-ish. Yes, it's that tacky, but it's great.
Hi, my name's Ashram Kane. I'm a producer here in Los Angeles, working primarily with the engineering and tech design team. So part of my job is working with engineering and tech design to get all of our ships converted over to a new framework, our Item 2.0 framework, which is going to support all of the multitude of features that we want to have in our ships moving forward in the game. The reason we had to do this conversion to get all these ships into this new framework was to support the kind of features we wanted in the long term.
In the case of ships that already existed, we do need to update various components, the seats, the way we enter the ships, and the way we interact with the items and the various systems on the ships, so we can make them work with the new interaction system. In the cases of new systems, we need to implement them in accordance with that new architecture.
It's easy enough to make a spaceship and put it in the game. Not that easy. But compared to what we're trying to do, it's a walk in the park. But when you want to have a spaceship with modular components that's upgradable, swappable, changeable, damageable, when you want to have ships that die because components fail inside, or ships that explode because of damage done to important internal pieces, that's not something you can do with a out-of-the-box system. It's something you have to build from scratch. Honestly, this conversion is involving every single team in the entire studio. There is not a team that is not part of this. And I mean everybody, from marketing all the way to the physics guys in Germany who are having to be part of this, because this conversion touches everything. It's primarily being driven by LA Engineering and LA Tech Design through Mark Abent and Kirk Tomei.
So as you guys know now, the current release, we're using the 1.0 infrastructure, and we've used that since basically we released the dogfight module way back during the dinosaur era. That system worked really great for our single-seater ships where, you used to have a guy sitting here, maybe one co-pilot. But when you started having these much more big, complex ships and you're just adding a bunch of items onto there, it became a big, gigantic behemoth to maintain our item infrastructure. The biggest issue we had is when we have our ship, he knows of all of the items that are attached onto here. And when you have a guy right here, he gets all these callbacks and events saying, hey, this was added, and you have control, you have control. And we have another seat. Since that event system was basically on the main route of the ship, he would get those same events. So if you had 5 seats, they would get events from everybody else, and then every other seat had to figure out who had what control and where. And then you had a more complex thing because then you had the visor, or the HUD, or the UI, you had the AI, you had the different modules, all listening for these events, trying to figure out who had control when, how. And then when you add in multiplayer where this seat could come before the vehicle, and then this item could come, and then we had to reconnect it, connect this here. Anything could come in any order. It just became pure chaos, trying to make sure everything worked in a nice, coherent manner. As you can tell, we had a lot of fun bugs, and it's also not maintainable, especially since each of those items were their very own special cupcakes, where we had all this logic built in for like the weapons. And if we want to use a single part of it, like say we had another type of weapon that didn't shoot projectiles, it shot we want to shoot M50s out. You had to basically copy pasta that logic into that other item, and then you have another set of bugs because you have to maintain 2 sets of logics blocks, and this was the whole Item 1.0 infrastructure. So it just became a mess. Going back to that big logical block, we wanted to take each of those bits of logic and turn them into these bits of, what we call them, components. This thing handles geometry, we take it out, stick it in a component that handles geometry. This thing handles physics, take that out, stick it into a component that has physics. The idea was we shrink this item into nothing but its bare bones, and it's just a list of logical blocks or components that define what the item actually did. So in theory, I could take this piece, put it here, take this piece, put it here, and now I have a whole new weapon, or I have a whole new logical item that we wanted to do. And that was the very bare bones Item 2.0 or infrastructure.
So the Item 2.0 system encompasses a lot of different components to make ships fit within our new architecture. The items that we're improving the gameplay functionality on are systems like power, cooling, the shield system, utilizing our new room system. When you turn power off to a particular room, all the lights that are in there will automatically turn off. Or when you open up a door that's connected to that room entity, we can suck the atmosphere out. Being able to do things like set a door lock in between those two rooms so that we can simply connect those two rooms utilizing that airlock, and it knows the states of the atmospheric conditions within those rooms and can react accordingly when you open that airlock. Implementing new ways in which atmospheric flight affects your fuel consumption, how those thrusters actually utilize power and fuel to fly. Better systems for functionality such as quantum drives. We're able to balance the fuel consumption that ships will take to go from one nav point to another. Therefore, we can make some of the ships that are larger and perhaps have a larger quantum fuel tank be able to make those trips without running out of fuel, where some of the smaller ships maybe they can't and they must refuel before they can take that next jump. These are all parameters that we're updating and making it a little bit more transparent for the player to understand what's going on with them.
So now that you have this control, it's cool, and the problem is, how do you interact with this control? And that's where we bring in this other set of technologies that we have, which is the interaction system. We had an old interaction system that hit a button and did something, but now we have much more contextual system where you could register these things called interactions on interaction points. And what that allows us to do is we could build a list of these things and then the code gets some callbacks. And if I look at, say, a door, I could get 2 interactions, maybe open and close. And then code could get those and figure out what to do with them. Using this thing with the control thing is basically we have this thing called a seat access with seats. Before, we have this ship called a Constellation, and we have these 2 turrets. And the thing about the turrets is when one came down, it had to block the other one, but we couldn't do that on the old one. So we kind of had to, you can actually do this now with the existing system. If you use the top turret, you could use the bottom turret and you can see the animations messing with each other because these 2 seats don't know about each other. But now we have this thing called a seat access that is aware of these 2. It's basically the state machine for these 2 things. So if you want to get into either one, it will block the other one. And we do that by using the interaction system. The top one has an interaction to enter exit. The bottom one has an interaction to enter exit. And there's a invisible physics box, but you'll just see a glowing thing saying, I can enter this turret or enter this turret. I'll walk up to it and you see actual floating text saying, I want to enter the top, I want to enter the bottom. So when I enter the top, the code will get the callback saying, I should begin to move this one down. And the seat access will be, all right, since this one is moving down, I could block this one. So now if someone walks up as you're entering this guy, he won't get any interactions because he can't enter this one because he's blocked until this guy goes up to the top, and then now that interaction will pop up saying, hey, you can enter now.
This isn't simply an engineering task or a design task. We're having to revisit animations. We're trying to revisit entire structures inside how ships are built from the ground up, which means we're having to reconsider how doors, simple doors, are implemented on the interior and exterior of the ship. And that's art time. That's time that the artists and modelers have to be involved in. And part of that means we're also having to do rework on some of the damage materials, the UV2s that we use for our damage states. Literally every team, one of the biggest impacts is things you wouldn't think about, like the prop team, because we're having to do things like build our power components and our modular power supplies. That means we need a prop for that, and that prop needs to be built by somebody. So all of a sudden, things that you never really saw on the ships, but were kind of there. I mean, they were a little bit hidden. They're suddenly going to be there. And as we start rolling out this technology more and more and implementing it through later iterations in the ships, you're going to be able to see these components inside the ships. And that means we need to have those components to show.
One awesome example of moving one of the items to this new whole Item 2.0 centric system on the vehicles is we have these lights on our spaceship. And with our 1.0 or legacy ships, we had an item that attached to an item port, and it would create these things called basically render nodes all along the ship. And it would look cool. I could see the lights on. Problem is, if I get out of the ship or the wing blows off, the lights are technically still there. We did cheat and listen for when something blew off, but power doesn't do anything. You can't control them. They're always kind of on. So what we did for 2.0 is we have this technology called an object container. In the inside of our ships, it's basically a mini level that we could insert into our ships. So we already have that. We're using that for our item 1.0. And what we want to do is, since the designers are placing a bunch of stuff like beds and all that stuff in there, we wanted them to use that same technology to have lights, those same lights that were defined before. So we basically tossed the old system, allowed designers to create lights, and using this thing called light groups, you could designate that these lights are basically, the interior, these lights are the exterior. You had a way of grouping them. When you export that level, they create these things called item ports, and we attach these lights on the item ports. And since they're on item ports, the control manager now knows about them. And since they're an item and they have an item port, they could get power, they could get control. So now they register to this thing called the control manager, and they register to the item ports, and they could actually request to get power, they could request to get heat, and if they don't get it, we could turn off the lights. We could do anything we want. And we took it a step further. We have this thing called a light controller. It registers to the control manager, and those lights register to that. And if a user sits down in the seat and you get into the control manager, I can hit a button to turn off those lights that are inside of the ship that normally don't spawn in.
It's not something that we can just sit down and say, we're going to do this ship and then this ship and then this ship, because it doesn't work like that. Each of these systems is so deeply interconnected that when we encounter a bug on one ship, we just can't stop and wait for that bug to be fixed. We have to move on to another ship that we can work on. We're having to work so quickly on so many different complicated pieces and track all of the bugs that the real challenge is being able to predict where we're going to be. And the whole point of scheduling isn't to make a plan of how to get someplace. That's the easy part. It's being able to show where we think we're going to be based on the work that we're doing and the work that we've done. This work has never been done before. Nothing like this has ever been done before.
The other difficult issue is that we do need to go in and do an entire retrofit of every single ship from step one. Some of the steps include converting the ship seats to the new system, creating a new dashboard element, which is the part of the ship when you're seated in the cockpit that you interact with, so that we can have visual interactions that come up that allow you to turn power on, engines on and off, set the ship to flight ready. These are interactions that occurred automatically before. Now we want to give the player a little bit more control to give them a more visceral feel when they're in the cockpit. This will also be true for other stations when you're seated. When we get an engineering station going, will allow you to aim in a certain direction, hit a button, this does a particular task, then utilize the screen so that you can divert power, do repairing, swap out individual items on the ship, etc. So in some cases, we take the old assets and then update the code that we use to implement them. In other cases, we update the asset itself so that it will adhere to the new code standard that we need. But in most cases, we'll do both. So we'll take the dashboard out of the ship geometry, make it its own item, and then set up the interaction points so that when the player does get seated in the seat, they'll have an indication of where to look at to do these interactions.
Coordinating all of these teams is a real challenge because we're talking about 400 people who need to be aware of what's happening. And the hardest part in coordinating all of these teams isn't necessarily tracking the tasks or the individual work on any given person, but making sure that all the teams are aware of what's happening and what's coming down the pipeline. We don't want to break something that's going to then prevent one of the teams from being able to work. A good example of this I can give is the AI team. We're having to be very conscious of delivering components and pieces of this feature in time for AI to have the opportunity to implement and integrate that with their system so that, we can have people inside these ships and they can fly around and interact in all the different game modes. This is particularly vexing when it gets to more complicated parts of the interaction system because these ships have a lot of interactions. And so making sure that all the interactions are functioning is sort of the key point to making sure we can interface with these ships as we change and integrate them into Item System 2.0. But then there's the tertiary stuff that you don't really think about when you're considering doing all of this stuff. How does this interface with stations? How is this going to work when you have to go buy and sell and be cognizant of all of the items inside your ship inventory, your personal inventory, your player inventory? And then where do we want to go with that? How does the economy interface with all of these other pieces? So making sure that everyone is cognizant of the long-term goals, as well as present in what we're trying to achieve for 3.0 and 3.1, that's the biggest challenge.
There will be some balance tweaks that the player will notice, which will incentivize the player to explore upgraded items, for example, especially in ships. Because we are utilizing the new interaction system, it's the first thing that they'll notice when they walk up to a ship, and when they get sat down and look at the cockpit, there'll be a noticeable difference.
Gameplay is one of the most interesting challenges in this conversion, because at once we need to maintain the gameplay that the community loves and the balance and hard work that the balance designers have implemented on these ships. On the other hand, we have to implement a whole new way of thinking about the ships and the ship balance. We have to implement new ways for the thrusters to function. We're rebuilding parts of IFCS and integrating IFCS into the item component system. And that means that we have to reconsider that balance as well. Suddenly a fighter is no longer just a fighter when you have to worry about managing your shields and your power supply and your weapon groups really in real time. With Item System 2.0, we're going to have a lot more capacity for multi-crew ships as well. It's no longer going to be, oh, I'm riding around in your Caterpillar. It's going to be, I need somebody on the shields and the power at the engineering station to manage this as I'm in a heavy fight.
One of the big things is probably performance. With this componentized system, each of these components, so if we have a seat, it could have geometry, it could have physics, it could have a bunch of other logic. Each one could have their own update, but they could update on this thing called a batch update, which means during a specific time in the frame, we basically spawn a bunch of threads and say, you're updating, you're updating, you're updating, you're updating, you're updating. We may do like a couple thousand at one go, and then do another 1,000, and then do another 1,000, so that frame update went from like this to like this, and we could do a lot more. One of the biggest improvements we're hoping is going to be with John Pritchett's physics flight controller, the IFCS. We just actually recently moved his update block from, it was kind of the main thread physics call, and it was stalling physics, and taking that out and moving into these batch updates. And it will still act the same, it's just now spawned off into one of those threads. So we're pretty much utilizing multi-core systems at this point.
This is one of the largest things I've ever worked on, and it singularly can be considered one of the largest things that I think has ever been done in a game, particularly a multiplayer game, because this is a system that, I mean, think about the multiplayer games that are out there. I mean, you might have a mount in World of Warcraft or Elder Scrolls Online or a house, but you don't fly your house around. You don't have 20 houses that you fly around and you have to worry about them being damaged and the states that they're all going to be in and how other players are going to interface with them. And that's something we're having to consider. When we talk about item system is more than just the things in a ship or the things on a space station or the things on a planet. It's an entire framework for objects and entities in the game persistence, being persisted and having actual relevant information to be part of that player experience. I think players are going to start seeing an incredible versatility and power to this technology.
So that was some of the big architectural changes we want to do. But of course, changing something huge is going to have some big repercussions. So stay tuned. Next time, I'm going to tell you about some horrible, horrible fun that we had to do when transitioning from A to B.